candidates are making their final push to voters. In the battleground state of Pennsylvania, Republican senatorial candidate Dr. Mehmet Oz will hold a series of campaign events this week, while President Joe Biden and former Presidents Barack Obama and Donald Trump will also be attending a campaign event in the state this week, as you just heard Ed O'Keefe say. So for more on the midterms, let's bring in CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa. Robert, you are in Pennsylvania right now.
Newtown, Pennsylvania. I was almost going to do that. Like, where in the world is
Bob Costa?
Yeah, because he's bouncing around.
Bouncing around. So what are you hearing from voters in Pennsylvania?
Good morning. I'm here in suburban Philadelphia, a vote-rich area, Newtown, Pennsylvania. And this is a crucial battleground in a potentially critical battleground for the battle of power in Washington. And so many voters here going to office parks this morning, coffee shops. They're talking about the economy. They're talking about issues like crime, and they're also talking about abortion rights. In particular, this is an area where you have suburban Republicans who have long supported some Republicans in office who are supportive of abortion rights. So it's a bit of a more moderate Republican area. And for Dr. Mehmet Oz and Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman, this is the place where the Senate election could be decided. The urban areas of the state, mostly Democratic. Much of the central part of the state, very heavily Republican. So it's the suburban collar counties of Philadelphia, like Bucks County here, that will really be where this election will be fought in the final days. Dr. Mehmet Oz will be here tomorrow in this area to have a rally.
Really in Bucks County, but in general, what are both parties doing to gain support or sway voters who may be still on the fence? I can't imagine it's a sort of a large percentage of people, but hey, every vote counts.
John Fetterman, who suffered a stroke months ago, is now arguing that Dr. Mehmet Oz is not prepared to be in the U.S. Senate himself because of his connections to former President Donald Trump. And he's trying to counter some of this talk after last week's debate among some voters, which we have heard about how John Fetterman's doing. And they hope he's doing well in most cases. And they also feel like that issue has moved to the front for some voters. John Fetterman is arguing he's fine. His doctor has released a letter, and he wants to shine the light on Dr. Mehmet Oz. There's a new story out in Rolling Stone magazine about how some people on Dr. Oz's campaign were part of those efforts to overturn the 2020 election. So John Fetterman is bringing attention back to January 6th, American democracy. And you have John Fetterman also talking about how Dr. Oz is still an outsider, in his view, in the state of Pennsylvania. But Dr. Mehmet Oz is saying he is someone very much in the line of Senator Pat Toomey, the Republican who's retiring from the Senate seat here in Pennsylvania. It shows that Oz is not necessarily running hard as a Trump candidate in this final lap of the midterms, but is trying to coordinate his campaign more to sound like a traditional Pennsylvania Pat Toomey type Republican.
So, Bob, you were at a rally over the weekend for Democratic candidate John Fetterman. He hit back at his opponent, Dr. Oz. Tell us about it.
CBS News was there over the weekend, and when John Fetterman got on stage, he brought up the health issue. Let's hear what Fetterman had to say.
I know with my stroke, Dr. Oz has never stopped reminding about that again and again. And at every event, everywhere I go, there's usually at least one person that's showing up trying to get me to miss some words. Yeah? And that's the truth. It's no secret. I'm going to miss some words. I'm going to mush some words up together. But you know, it's not it's not exactly how inspiring of a campaign as that is. What?
Fetterman has been very busy on the campaign trail in the days after that Senate debate. You saw him in that clip talking about his health and saying the Oz campaign has done a lot, in his view, to bring unnecessary attention to his recovery from a stroke earlier this year. Fetterman wants to get out there, his allies tell me, to show that he's vigorous despite his ongoing recovery from a stroke, to show voters he's more than fit to serve in the U.S. Senate. And Fetterman has been rapping Oz through different social media announcements, different campaign press releases, that Oz is not doing enough campaign events. Oz will have events later this week in Pennsylvania, seems to not have any events that are publicly listed today on Monday. But you do see this contesting of who's busier, who's talking to more voters. And Fetterman wants to be out there having these rallies, and he needs these core Democratic voters to show up in Philadelphia, in suburban Philadelphia, in his home area of Western Pennsylvania, Braddock, Pennsylvania. Strong Democratic turnout in a midterm year is going to be so important because they don't have the wins of a presidential year to lift the Democratic side.
So you mentioned that Dr. Oz, a Republican, not really sort of campaigning as a Trumper per se, though Donald Trump has supported him. Then we go over to the governor's race. And we've got Doug Mastriano, the Republican there, who is 100%, I think, a Trumper.
Yeah.
And Josh Shapiro, that's the Democrat. How are things shaping up with the governor's race in Pennsylvania?
I've spoken to Josh Shapiro, the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, in recent days, and he's really making a hard play for the voter here in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. He wants that suburban Republican to say Mastriano is too far to the right, and so Shapiro is the way to go. And so Shapiro is someone who's been pacing ahead of Mastriano, a state senator and, as you said, a Trump ally in almost every poll. But Shapiro and his campaign, they are taking nothing for granted because they know this could be a year where the Republicans have a lot of wind at their back, and so they want to make sure the Democrats are coming out, and they're trying to court those Republican voters, those independent voters, to come over to Shapiro. Shapiro has been unabashed in his support of former President Trump and about his efforts to overturn the 2020 election to block the certification of Joe Biden. He's unapologetic. He says he's an outsider in politics. He's a conservative, and he's proud of it. And he's running on that as a way to really have a turnout election from the Republican base. That's his path to victory in the eyes of his allies I've spoken with.
Yeah, there was also a really surreal moment there in Pennsylvania, Robert, where I believe it was Mastriano's wife who, in answering a question from a reporter, suggested that she and her husband were perhaps that they were bigger supporters of Israel than even some Jewish people, which I thought was sort of gaslighting, given that Josh Shapiro himself is Jewish.
Right.
Although Israel is a different country and has nothing to do with the United States, but why? I just couldn't understand what the connection was there.
So charges of anti-Semitism have hovered over this gubernatorial race. Josh Shapiro, the Attorney General and Democratic gubernatorial nominee, attended schools growing up that were affiliated with the Jewish faith. And because of that, he and his supporters have been unhappy, frustrated, and angry at times about how Doug Mastriano, the state senator from Pennsylvania, has characterized Josh Shapiro's upbringing. Mastriano has referred to Shapiro as someone who went to privileged schools, elite schools, and that language, Shapiro's argues, are saying is very loaded and brings anti-Semitism to the fore in a way that's inappropriate and unnecessary. And so this is a deeply personal, highly charged gubernatorial race that has brought up issues of anti-Semitism and charges of that, which prompted the exchange with Mastriano and his wife in recent days about Israel, about anti-Semitism. It's brought up questions about American democracy in January 6th. And that's just another example why Pennsylvania matters, why we're here, because this is not just a red and blue race. This is a race that's a snapshot of America and some of the messier parts and darker parts of American politics at this moment.
So true, Robert, especially where you are in Bucks County, for sure.
Yep.
Thank you so much.